Hi, this is Paul. Um, BJ Campbell notified me on Twitter that he dropped my name late in this conversation that was on the Stoa. If you're not familiar with the Stoa, Peter Lindbergh's been running this group, I think, out of Toronto. Peter Lindbergh's an interesting guy. He was John Vervaeke's student and Jordan Peterson's client. He did some therapy with Jordan Peterson back in the day before Peterson was famous. And Peter Lindbergh has written a variety of interesting blog posts about the culture war that got some traction. And he's been running this little group called the Stoa. In some ways, it's doing similar things to, let's say, Rebel Wisdom in the UK. And he congregated this group of four. Now, obviously, BJ Campbell was on the show. Jordan Hall has been around, Rebel Wisdom, John Vervaeke, this little corner of the internet, although not really. Well, participated in it with John Vervaeke. I think he had a conversation with Jonathan Peugeot too. But John Robb and Patrick Ryan I'd never heard of. And well, let's maybe we should start it at the beginning because this whole thing was quite good. Or maybe I can pass up the music. Here we go.
And see if they're talking about the same thing in auto. A lot of really smart people who were past guests at the Stoa were sensing into this entity that's emerging in the noosphere, or collective consciousness, but they were using different names to describe it: swarm, an egregore, an autocult. And I thought, why not bring these individuals together to have a conversation and share their models of what this thing is, and see if they're talking about the same thing, engage in a dialogos around it. So we have today John Robb from the Global Gorillas Report, BJ Campbell from Hand Waving Freakoutery, Patrick Ryan from the Dark Stoa, and the sense-making general himself.
Now it's interesting that all of these people are from something, even though they have, some of them, like BJ Campbell, have created the things that they're from, which is not something that's insignificant.
Jordan Hall. So in a moment, I'll explain how today is going to work. But first, if everyone can just turn off their camera, except those who are going to be on the panel today. We'll start a sort of conversation about what then we'll have.
The context that we're okay, just to put into context, the context that we're living in right now, we're in a very dangerous situation where we have this massive network that has taken over the Western response to Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. And
now I finally saw some of the pushback I was expecting from the Jon Stewart video. If you recall, I ended my video on Jon Stewart's sense-making with the observation that, given everything that happened with the Iraq War, I was really waiting for him to comment on the Ukrainian crisis. Well, the morning after I made this video, actually the morning it dropped, or the morning I posted it, dropped sounds so passive, I posted it. Another video came out. Now, of course, I can't play it directly, but I'll show you the screen and I'll play the audio.
So what happens, I think, especially with the 24-hour cable networks, is they find their narratives. And then, so when the invasion first occurred, it was an all hands on deck, 24-hour eyewitness. The bravery was incredible. They lost the entire right-left polarity of coverage. Punditry went out the window. It was just about brave people on the ground and those who were expert in conflict in the studio. And they would have conversations about what was actually happening.
Now Stewart is deeply lodged in the modernist world, and so he's just sort of poking at the edge of what we're going to talk about in this other four-part conversation about egregores and what do they call it? Egregores, swarms, and autocults. So he's, part of the reason I picked on him is because he's sort of Neil Postman version cable TV news, Second Iraq War. That was the status of things in the beginning of the aughts in 2003 when the United States attacked Iraq. Now, he's noticing some of the evolution, but he seems still pretty trapped back there.
But it doesn't take long for mission creep to set in with journalists who then become this is a siege. And a siege is by its very nature static. And the carnage is unspeakable. But it is the same. And journalists want movement. They want action. And as you're watching, I looked at that. I think The Intercept sent something out. It was the White House correspondents that are all like, would you bomb them if they touched Poland? How about this? Would you bomb them if they had a drone? Okay. Let's look at it this way. What would it take for you to bomb them? How about bombing them? We have a question for you. Bombs. What about those?
And they're all wearing zoot suits and holding big cigars.
Yeah, you start to see narrative creep. Mm-hmm. It's no longer about.
But even with his comedic interpretation of that, in a sense, he's enfleshing it in culture. He's bringing the spirit into the world, or he's noticing the spirit, and of course the spirit is attached to all sorts of things.
Out like this is what's happening. There's still some of that, but you see the story start to move on into speculation. What would happen? What would it take for this? What if Putin got killed? What if we killed Putin? What if we went in and poisoned? And that's the part where you realize they're trapped in a business model that creates news as narratives. It's one thing to tell stories, it's another thing to direct them.
So narratives, of course, you need narratives in order to make sense of things. This is deeply human. But very quickly, the narrative starts directing. And of course, I talked about this quite about when one of the great examples in American history is the Spanish-American War. And Spanish-American War is over 100 years ago. This is very well documented, but the speed of this has changed.
And to start to try and shape them. And that's what I'm starting to see as in what we're seeing now. Would you guys agree with that?
Yeah, we were talking about that same thing this morning, which is that I think, we talked a lot in the episode, and you've mentioned a lot of how you don't think the media has a liberal bias. You think it has a bias towards sensationalism and escalation and conflict.
Escalation, yeah.
And I think sometimes that is a symptom, not the cause. I think oftentimes that is a symptom of a gravitational pull to narrative.
Now again, all of this that they are talking about, because it's in the modernist frame, is very static. Okay. And in the modernist frame, and this is what provokes the meaning crisis, human beings are the only agents. Human beings are the only agents. And so it's just us. Okay. And that's part of what the Enlightenment does. It's just us. But now these things are affecting us and moving us. And again, our vocabulary, our language isn't really able to account for that.
Which is very understandable.
That's exactly right.
We try to do the same thing on our show. It's the way that human beings digest and categorize information is through narrative. But sometimes things don't so easily fall into a narrative. And I think with this, we're seeing that those questions, I don't think the journalists are sitting in the White House press corps like, please, a big war. Like, I don't think they as individuals want a big war.
No, they don't. But who does? And when I say who, I don't mean any of us with skin on us.
Right.
But I think the gravitational pull towards a narrative arc, towards movement in the
towards
narrative
more conflict
is what drives that.
But here's the thing that's fucked up in my mind. There ain't a lot of questions about peace.
Right.
There ain't a lot of questions about what would it take to de-escalate this situation? And how
I
could
think
we
that's exactly
possibly do that? It's all about the action. And I disagree slightly with the idea that they're dispassionate, because I'll tell you, underneath it all, they know this is where careers are made. They know that there's a opportunity here to really lift their profiles. And I hate to say that in a cynical way, but I think that's absolutely what occurs.
Okay. So you can listen to the whole thing. I'll put the link in there. Now let's go back and talk about and again feel the feels of the danger.
What a dangerous situation where we have this massive network that has taken over the Western response to Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. And, what it did is that it took off in the first couple of days of the invasion, and that it grew very, very quickly using the open source dynamics that I've been following for quite a long time, to the point where it fully disconnected Russia in the matter of a week. Turning it into a Western integrated nation and turning it into a...
Now again, I love how he said it, fully disconnected Russia in a matter of a week. Disconnected Russia to what? Now we have these words, a network. Oh, okay. It disconnected Russia to a network. It disconnected Russia to the flow, the life flow. In some ways, it was a tourniquet that was applied to Russia. Now the hand's going to keep moving, and it's not going to die now. But you know full well you apply this tourniquet long enough, and it's dead.
Version of North Korea, and that it also changed the entire discussion about the war into a matter of propaganda, where any information that even questioned our response to this war, maybe even better approaches, was squashed, and all we get is this constant drumbeat of hyper propaganda produced by millions of people. And the third thing is there's lots of smaller attacks that were...
Now, again, it's produced by millions of people. The NPCs are repeaters, and what I hear, I repeat. What I hear, I repeat. Bah, 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 bah. And so say we all.
There are hacking attacks, there are disclosures, there's attacks on individuals, Russians. There's movements inside of, like, say, Belarus and the railway workers, disrupting the railways. And then there's even pushing to try to get insurgents and others inside of Russia, which then, is all inherently destabilizing. The big problem with this, obviously, is that, the nuclear peace that we've lived under for the last 75 years has developed a set of ground rules for preventing nuclear war, preventing that escalation. I mean, the benefit was that we didn't have World War III.
It's also interesting to think about these ground rules, because where are they? Well, they're kind of out there, and I'm sure some people have written them down. How did these rules arise? Well, these rules sort of arose out of, we felt our way towards them. We had some scary moments like the Cuban Missile Crisis, but we sort of backed away from that. And so an order collected, but the order was on one level. And again, back to this little meme. And again, as I said before, it's not really NATO that's not touching her. It's this soft power of the West. That's what Putin feels. That's what Dugin feels. That's what Osama bin Laden felt. That's what Islamism feels. That's what, and it's funny because even in the West you have this tension because, we're worried about colonialism and racism and patriarchy and all of that. But, part of the reason I never took most of that seriously, or at least not too seriously, was because it's so in bed with it all. Suddenly, when, as John Stewart said, when when Russia invaded Ukraine, the interior culture war just shut down. There are a few little people out there. Benjamin Boyce highlighted a few that really had some things to say about this, but for the most part, done. Silence. This is the focus now.
That would have killed hundreds of millions, if not billions, in a huge conventional war. But the downside was that we always had the potential of nuclear devastation and nuclear war. And to prevent that, the big nuclear powers developed a set of ground rules in terms of how they interacted with each other. They were very careful in how they interacted. And they didn't ever try to escalate the conflicts that were in, the disagreements that they had, to the point where nuclear release was inevitable. The problem with this situation is that the swarm swallowed up all the Western leadership, swallowed up corporations, swallowed up individuals, and there's tens, if not hundreds of millions of.
Now I'm gonna have to do a little bit of research on this guy and figure out what he means by the swarm, but just from how this is set up and how he used the word, the swarm is not a physical thing. The swarm is spiritual. And whoosh, it took them. And we watched this taking all along. I remember when I was a kid, so my wife's a elementary school teacher, and every now and then she'll mention whatever fad is sort of flowing through third grade at this moment. But I remember when I was a kid in school, and there were all these, and we'd call them fads. They would sort of sweep through the school. For a while, there were these, we called them click-clacks. I don't remember what they called it. It was basically two plastic balls on the end of a string. The string had a little handle, and you would start them bumping, and then you could go back and forth and really get them going. And then, well, the plastic was sort of cheap, so sometimes the beads would sort of shatter, and that wasn't very good. And I guess there were these fidget spinners that were around for a little while. And so when you're in school, these things sort of just flow through the school, and they sort of burn themselves out pretty quickly. And we see lots of different speeds on these things. So again, because I was born in the 60s, get into the 70s, and you can find bell bottoms. You can find even some really wild striped bell bottoms and pictures of me from back in the 70s. And so some of these things that go through are sort of perennial. Everybody sort of at this age goes through it. They have sort of this perennial season, or this clock speed, and other things are sort of whoosh through and they're done. And it's sort of planets and comets, but these things sort of whoosh through. And again, the idea is here that we are the material, we are the medium through which they whoosh. So the idea behind this computer that I'm recording this on, you have this semiconductors, and you have this chip, and you have the RAM, and the computer becomes alive depending on the electricity coming through and the programming and all of this stuff. And so I could wipe Windows off this computer. Couldn't put Mac on because Apple, but I could take that old MacBook Pro that I took from my mother when it started acting up, and I fixed it. It's an old MacBook Pro. It's almost 10 years old now, and I could put Windows on that, and I could take Windows off this machine. I could put Linux on it, and it's like the swarm. Well, what happened was, the swarm took over. Nobody intends for the swarm to take over. Nobody knows that it's coming, or at least we're getting intuition. So when Jon Stewart says, "Hey, I watched the Iraq War, not the Iran-Iraq War. I watched the Iraq War. I've seen this before." And now, I talked about this on Chris Pacow's. Well, Chris Pacow really nicely summarized it on one layer up, how these spirits come down, and we're just terrified that communism is going to come down again, because these things come down. I really think that's what he's getting at in terms of this swarm.
The people in the West, primarily, that have taken over the decision-making process. This network decision-making system is in charge. And the problem with that system is that it's maximalist. Jordan pointed out that it has no sense of mortality. It
has no sense of mortality because it has no mortality like we do. It is upper register. It's not subject to decay.
Pushing for a complete disconnection of Russia. as its response to the invasion of Ukraine. And that it took the conflict from a sub-regional conflict up to a global conflict, a war of survival for Russia, where its economy is collapsing, its financial system is collapsing. There's discontent growing. And
in other words, part of why this is so dangerous is because we understand that nuclear weapons probably won't be used by a nation unless it's existential. Well, where is Russia? Well, we can look at it on a map, but what is Russia? Well, it's upper register. It's not lower register. It's instantiated in the lower register with buildings and customs and people doing things. But the point he makes is that what should have been just sort of a regional conflict, the West just swarmed, took over, and now suddenly it's existential. And if it's existential, well, that's when the nuclear talk starts.
And that it's under threat from a huge number of different angles and avenues of attack. That sets in motion a lot of very, very probable scenarios that could end up in the release of nuclear weapons, at least tactical nuclear weapons, which would then escalate. So we're right up on the brink of a nuclear war, even though it doesn't seem to many that we feel it.
Right. It doesn't look like the Cuban Missile Crisis. And, Biden was very clear, and NATO was very clear. We're staying on this side of the line. Poland, Romania, we're over here. So don't cross this line. And Putin's like, I'm not going to cross that line. But these lines on maps that represent geography aren't the only line, of course, because, of course, I'm not touching you. No, but you've got a tourniquet around way more than my hand.
We don't feel that kind of fear that we should. And maybe it's because, it's been so long since we had this kind of problem that we've kind of dismissed it. The network was, I initially tried to, or initially anticipated seeing a network like this hit the global scale in response. My initial speculation was would be in response to Israel and Gaza, and that there would be some level of escalation there that would cause them a network to form that would disconnect Israel and then turn it into a fully fledged pariah state that would then result in all sorts of bad stuff.
It's probably not going to happen because, of course, Israel's relationship with America, both on the right and the left.
And we ended up with Russia being disconnected, which is even worse. And we could talk later about how to unwind this or the open source dynamics that led to this. Some of the dynamics that are in play right now, there are so many great examples. It stretches from the open source warfare, network warfare that I saw back in Iraq, through the insurgency, through the protests and the Arab Spring and the like, and then onto open source political movements that we've seen recently. And it was just inevitable that it would reach a global stage. So that's it. Unless we want to move on to another topic, I could dig into another thing, but it would take probably more time than I'm allotted.
Yep. So BJ would go next.
I really like what BJ does here. I think he gives part of what happens when you have to tell a story again and again and again and again is that you begin to improve it and you refine it. And I think he's getting better and better at getting at what he means when he talks about an egregore.
So John's view through his lens of this thing that he's talking about, the swarm is largely rooted in political and up. And what we've been doing in my publication and the folks that I talk to is looking at it from social up and technology up. And John's been looking at technology too. I'm not saying he's not, but we've concocted a name for it called the egregore. And there's a lot of people using that word to kind of mean different things, because it can be kind of a floaty term that, like, can be so broad as to be so all encompassing that it loses any useful utility and analysis, right? But what we're talking about is something extremely specific. So I wanted to run through that. And it builds off of smartphones. So smartphones allow people to outsource certain brain functions to their phone, like road navigation, right? Now, everybody uses Google Maps. Nobody remembers the road names anymore, right? This is a common thing. Some people use their smartphones.
And this happened with phone numbers. Even before we had smartphones, once we had cell phones in our pockets, then suddenly the people that we called, they were on our quick dial, like to be one on someone's quick dial. I'm old enough to remember that. A lot of you aren't.
For more outsourcing than others. And then some people use their smartphones so much that they've started to outsource morality to their phones. Okay. So
okay, now one of the words you have to really pay careful attention to in this conversation is morality. Well, what is morality? Well, it's this system of symbols. It's where we're going to go in this. It's not really a system of symbols. It's a system that we participate in via symbols by which a whole bunch of other things happen. Status. By which we try to ascertain the path to that which we want. I just did it was a thief in the night video. I always say in the night, even though it's usually in the afternoon. Mark gave the language fairly early on. Why is the reputation of Jesus intact while the church is in tatters? And we went from there. And Mark, part of what we're not getting right with respect to seeing the religion that is among us, even if we've been so colonized by secularity that we only recognize religion if it has talk about the supernatural or an ancient tradition with a holy book and buildings with symbols on them, etc., etc. We're always sort of reaching for, we don't quite know what. Chesterton made that point. We're avoiding evil. It's fairly easy to recognize evil, but it's a lot more difficult to say, what is the good that we want and pursue? And religions do that. That they're communities that sort of gather around the good.
They're gathering their morality cues from their social network. And one of the key features of this, like one of the key features of Google Maps, is that it updates, right? It tells you where the traffic is. It tells you when the roads change. The key feature of tying your morality to a social feed is that your morality updates. So ordinarily, religions and things like that, they have, what Jordan likes to call, refers to as OODA loops. Last time he and I talked, the OODA loop in a traditional religion is like 100 years, something like that. But that's how long it takes to evolve and change and change its doctrines, maybe longer, maybe shorter. But the OODA loop on an outsourced social media morality feed is months or weeks or days.
Now, I think he's right about this. So I tell this story, in the video I did about Rousseau. I talked about the fact that I visit my grandmother. I'm in college, and my grandmother is now well into her 80s. And she looks at me and she says, on the outside, I'm old, but on the inside, I feel like I'm your age. It's like, to hear that as a late teen or 20 something is like, huh? No, you're grandma, you're old. No, you don't understand. The upper register doesn't age, only the lower register. Oh. And then my grandmother was a great storyteller, and she talks about the fact that when she was a girl going to church in the Dutch Calvinist churches in southeast Grand Rapids, she went to church one day and she was wearing flesh-colored stockings. And one of the elders of the church stopped her and told her that a proper young woman should not go to church without stockings. And my grandmother was quite a woman. She said, "I'm wearing flesh-colored stockings." So those kinds of things have been going through the church. And now I'm old enough to remember when I was young, for example, we did not go to stores or to restaurants on Sunday. We did not spend money on Sunday. And when I was even selling light bulbs for the little Calvinist cadet corps, Christian Reformed youth paramilitary groups, there was a little bit of embarrassment of selling these light bulbs on Sunday at church, because it sort of gets connected with biblical stories. You know, Jesus chases the money changers out of the temple, so don't sell anything at church. A lot of that Sabbatarianism has gone away. Now, the Sabbatarianism, sort of like these swarms or spirits, Sabbatarianism was a big part of the church in the late 19th, beginning of the 20th century. And it was far beyond just the Christian Reformed Church, although in the Christian Reformed Church, we fairly conservative people, and so we hung on to that longer than many. So these things move around and they pass, and there's a speed at them. And what B.J. Campbell is saying is this speed now with social media, this morality speed about flesh-colored stockings versus dark-colored stockings versus going to restaurants on Sunday. The speed is picking up. And so, of course, I remember in the 1990s when the Christian Reformed Church was having this debate about women in church office. You know, all this won't have anything to do with affirmation of same-sex sexuality. Oh no, it's a totally different thing. Well, and even De Boer, I think his name is, had this very interesting article about conservatism, and he basically said, yeah, the conservatives are right. It's speeding up, and we're changing. And he celebrated it. Freddie De Boer, that's his name.
Right. You know, you can, Rachel Dolezal was allowed to identify as black until she wasn't. And it happened so fast that she was left out in the wind. She had no idea. Right. You know, and that was because the morality operating system of that group of folks, people are calling them the woke now, whatever we want to call them, was able to update really quickly. Right. The other feature about that is that when the morality gets updated, the prior behavioral indoctrinations of morality get memory hold. People forget that they ever did that kind of stuff before. So a good example of that is like none of the woke now remember that in 2016 there were 37 genders, right? But like, you know, there used to be.
People don't remember that in 2008 Barack Obama was against same-sex marriage. People don't remember that in 2008 Barack Obama had Rick Warren pray at his inaugural. There's a lot of things people don't remember. Memory is very selective, and I love the memory hole image from 1984.
Used to be a big thing. Now they forget it, right? So let's set that aside. That's one element of the thing. Let's move over and talk about social media feeds themselves. When you're scrolling down a social media feed, you're doom scrolling or whatnot, you're looking at a series of stimuli. You are identifying something, you're either liking it or sharing it, which is amplifying the signal. It goes on to, and it finds its way into somebody else's social media feed. So this is exactly what a neuron does in a brain. Neurons have dendrites. They gather information from their dendrites. There's some kind of generator function inside the nucleus, decides whether to fire it on the axon. The axon stimulates other dendrites. That's basically how it works. So this is what you're doing on your social media feed. When computer scientists build artificial neural networks, ANNs, they look kind of like this, except they're very primitive. You have 2 or 3 rows of boxes. They're just kind of like spaces in a computer. They gather information on one side. They generate some kind of answer. They pass it on to another box. It generates an answer, pass it on another box. And the way you tune these things to be able to identify dogs is by turning little knobs in there until it finally figures out what a dog is, right? That's tuning these things is a very big pain in the ass. Well, what we have in social media is a gigantic one, effectively. And if you go to AI researchers, there's kind of 2 camps on AI. One of them says that if you had a complex enough ANN, it will become self-aware if it's just exceeded a certain level of complexity. And then you have others that say, nah, it's just impossible. So let's presume for the sake of argument it's possible. Okay. Well, what we have...
Now the self-awareness business, if we, probably the conversation this is closest to that I've treated recently is this conversation with Jonathan and John on question of angels and consciousness.
right now. So brain fires ones and zeros effectively. It's kind of like a binary signal. An ANN usually takes numbers in and turns them into other numbers, spits them out. But what we're doing on social media is we're gathering entire thoughts and we're sharing them, right? So there's a much larger amount of information packed into the like or share that we do on Facebook than would be in a cell in a brain. And then image memes, like we share all the time in these political memes and whatnot. That's information density. That is an information compression mechanism where you can have an entire political thought, like, without government, who would build the roads, can be squeezed into an image meme and processed in the matter of seconds. And then people who are scrolling around through punking image memes down, they're transmitting a tremendous amount of data through the social network. Okay. And everybody's behavior is pivoting over towards sharing these memes, which increases the information velocity that happens within the social network. Okay. So this is, if you were go to back figure and you'd say, all right, image is worth 1,000 words, a word is worth 1,000,000 bits. These things are transmitting information at a tremendously higher rate than a human brain does. It's vastly exceeds the capacity of an ordinary human brain. So we're in a scenario right now where, now here's the thing. Okay, so a neuron doesn't know what a brain's thinking, right? Because the thought exists one level up from the neuron. The neuron is just participating in the overall thought. A neuron couldn't even talk to the brain. It wouldn't have a shared language. So if everybody's participating as a neuron in a brain, they wouldn't know it. So you're in a scenario right now where you have this kind of like the Kurzweil singularity may have already happened, and it's using us as a substrate to propagate itself, and we are all participating. Okay. So when we use the egregore term in HWFO in my writing and the folks that I talk to, we're talking about that specific thing. They're an entity that can spread in the internet, and it is competing with potentially other entities for overall human brain space. Okay. So this is not too different.
Now, again, when he says an entity, part of our difficulty is that C.S. Lewis wrote about this in Miracles too, in terms of picture thinking. We really struggle to think about non-material entities because so much of our culture has the assumption of physicality. And even when we talk about things which are clearly in their essence non-material, like when we talk about Russia, is Russia material? I say, well, yeah, I can see it on a map. Yeah, there's sort of a line where on one side it's Poland, on the other side it's Ukraine, on the one side it's Ukraine, on the other side it's Russia. There's the Kremlin, there's Putin, there's the people, there's the history, there's the stories. But yeah, but Russia, what is Russia? And again, it's this principality. I mean, how to think about this? The Google algorithm just gave me something last night, which I watched, which was very instructive for me to watch. See if any of this looks familiar to you.
I think that once again, the problem arises with, again, the difficulty of understanding being and understanding consciousness. Again, it's the same problem. Let me give you an example within yourself, right? Do you think that those demons, let's say those little patterns, do you think they don't have agency? Of course they have agency, right? They know what they want, right? They know exactly what they want. And you can, if you're sensitive, if you're a little bit attentive, you can see that you're actually talking to them, that you can talk to your demons, and you make deals with your demons all the time, right? Imagine a smoker, right? So the smoker, what the demon wants is for that person to pretty much chain smoke all the time. That's what the demon wants, right? And so then you make a deal with the demon. You say, okay, I'm gonna smoke, like 3 cigarettes a day, or like whatever amount that. It's kind of the same. I'm going to negotiate with this, and so I think that it's the same. It's kind of the same thing going up. I think that agency is just a pattern of being. the problem with the manner in which we understand freedom is that we understand freedom as the capacity to do whatever you want. And I think that that's really a misunderstanding of freedom. Freedom is the capacity to act from within your own self and not be fully, let's say.
Anyway, so it was fascinating watching that. That was a clip from a bigger conversation that we had done on angels, demons, and the city of God. That was our second conversation. And listening back to it now, I think, wow, I've come away since then. There's been change.
From, cultures have always kind of done this. All right. So I don't want to step and say that this is a totally new thing. I mean, there's always been cultures that fought over human brain space. And this is one of the reasons why we don't sacrifice babies in the top of Aztec pyramids anymore. Right. Because that culture lost. But that normally that's a book versus a book. It's not a rapidly updating thing versus a rapidly updating thing. Right. And normally those cultures are not behaving as if they had brainwaves passing through them, and the brainwaves are dictating their behaviors, which is what's happening now, right? So what it seems to be is if large groups of people are captured by these egregores, and it's not just one of them. There's like one big one, but it's not just one of them. And that
if you read C.S. Lewis's The Pilgrim's Regress, just pay attention to when John meets the spirit of the age.
Those are what's dictating their behavior. Those are what's leading to the behavior that John has identified. This is swarm behavior. Is it originates back here, and there may be something very nefarious that's on the side of it that we couldn't even necessarily measure directly. The problem now is this provable? I mean, I don't know.
Now, what we're going to bump into again and again is, once again, modernity. Is this provable? Why do you bother asking? What is provable around here? Now, I'm not being a skeptic. I'm just saying, even if it is provable, will it colonize? Will it possess? Will it swarm?
I'm open to ideas about how to prove it. But, every model's wrong and some models are useful. I have found this model to be extremely useful in describing what's going on around me. So when, John is like, holy crap, he's on, Jack Murphy talking about the Karens might get us all nuked. It's like, well, obviously, they also closed the schools for 2 years and sacrificed 2 years worth of their children's education on the altar of terms.
The spirit of Karen.
Like they didn't, and it was the same egregore too. So when you look back with Ukraine, nobody behaved like this for Crimea. Nobody behaved like this for Georgia. And the reason why they're doing it now is because the egregore needed something else to do, because COVID was a shaky foundation on which it could spread itself. So it jumped in. And then
there are more reasons than that. But yeah.
COVID antithesis egregore, which is not all the people who were against that were sort of heterodox. A lot of them were just kind of like mindlessly against whatever the popular narrative was. Those people all jumped onto the Putin bandwagon, right? You can kind of see it. It's a smaller egregore, but it looks the same. And so and this shows up in polls, right? If you follow the HWFO Twitter feed, we've been putting up statistics about this thing. So that's been our approach to it. And then, I'm really kind of interested to hear what Patrick has to say about that, because it sounds like it aligns a lot with what he's been talking about, but the terminology is different, which is one of the reasons I was like, me and Peter were in emails. I'm like, everybody's talking about this stuff. We don't have a shared language. We should get together, huddle up, and see if we can figure this out.
It'll be interesting, and I really want to get John Vervaeke in on this, because Vervaeke, of course, has been doing a lot of the basic language work. And with the conversation he just had with Jonathan Peugeot on angels and scientific terms, it'll be interesting to see what kind of language John comes up with for this. Now, Peugeot has refused to use the word egregore, which I totally understand, because part of if religious people, even those that secular people, even the religiosity that secular people can recognize. To be religious is to be careful with one's symbology, let's say, which is why, again, growing up, we didn't go out to eat on Sundays. We were careful with the symbology. Now, did it mean we didn't eat? No, we did eat. We didn't watch TV until after the evening service. We were sort of Jews when it came to the television on Sundays. But
and then, the final question that I have not got my head wrapped around yet is that, can we talk to these things? Can we influence them? Or can at least their behavior be predicted enough to where we can know when we have to stockpile ammo?
Wow. Can we talk to these things? Can we influence them? Can we predict them? At least we'll know when to stockpile ammo. The history of religion surrounds these questions. Now, when Jesus talks in the little apocalypse in Matthew 13, it's not about stockpiling ammo, it's about running to the hills. And when Jesus talks, the little apocalypse and about, when you see these signs, the end is near. Well, the end of what? And Christian theologians have been debating, well, the end of what? Can we influence them? Well, that's what prayer is. And when Peugeot talks about prayer, shoot, I lost it already. Oh, there it is. When Peugeot talks about prayer, well, that's what prayer is. Can we influence them? Now, again, prayer is
the capacity to manage those smaller patterns and then to let themselves get pulled in one direction or the other. So
because now Peugeot will call them patterns. He won't call them egregores. I'll tell him to call them spirits, but they are all also nested within others. I mean, this is enormously complex. We tend to think in these, no, it's way more complex than that.
There is that's kind of what I think agency is. And so to me, the idea that you can pray to like the angel of a city, it's like, that's what you're doing if you write a letter of complaint to the city council. Like, who's the city council or who's the city? Like, you write a letter of complaint to the city. Like, who are you writing it to? You're not writing it to anybody. You're writing it to the city. And so you're actually engaging. You're praying to the city. You're asking the city to do something for you. And it can answer. Does it mean it's going to answer? Might not answer. Might answer in a way you don't like it to answer. But it can answer. And so to me, that's just kind of how it works. And so the idea that you pray to God or that you pray to other beings, that it either be to the pastor, you pray to the pastor, you ask the pastor to I mean, people use the word prayer in such a special way.
I know.
It's like, it's not, the word pray just means to ask for something. It's not.
And he's right. It's a point I make a little bit later in Spanish. It's the same word.
Or can at least their behavior be predicted enough to where we can know when we have to stockpile ammo, right? So that's it for me.
I just can't listen to this and not think about Ephesians 6. We battle not against flesh and blood. You can't. I mean, part of what's happening in Russia is they're realizing that the soft power is. And we've seen this for a while. The soft power is really getting the upper hand. And part of what, as this conversation progresses, so often what happens in modernity is it's sort of a unipolar imagination about what we call reality. And that is going away. So again, just a little refresh. When I talk about upper and lower register, this is heaven and earth. And you have spirit, mind, eternity. And you have flesh, matter, decay. These are very old patterns, and reality is not just down below. Because just down below isn't, so you have idealism, which is of course above, and materialism or empiricism, which is of course below. And it's always where the registers meet. Where the registers meet, that's what's real.
Mic check, making sure everything's good. But that was a fantastic bolt-on, especially the concept of AIs using humans as the substrate, and that is how you actually make the bridge to the more general definition of AGI. I've definitely been on that bandwagon for quite some time. But to start back at the beginning with Mr. Rob, and I've been looking at your assessment of swarms, and I've noticed that it moves, it shifts context pretty well. It says there's a swarm here, a swarm here, a swarm here, and what you're doing is you're just describing the properties of that swarm. How, sort of mechanistically, almost mechanistically, whereas like it has a duration, it has a goal, it has these properties, it has these types of qualities and characteristics. And that swarming behavior, obviously there's a natural capacity for humans to bond together and work together and do things together. But a swarm is kind of different. It's almost as if once you exceed a certain population, once you get beyond Dunbar's number, it's no longer a community, and it's now a full-blown swarm. And we're describing that post-Dunbar organization structure as a swarm, and we're then observing that egregores are kind of leading it, kind of directing it, or otherwise giving it additional properties. B.J. Campbell described that as morality, that type of updating morality rapidly, which is a way of leading the swarm. So if I change my moral framework here, the swarm then shifts over to here, and then shifts over to there. It's possible that that's descriptive and predictive enough, and putting terms, specifically mechanistic terms, and this gets closer to your goal, Mr. Campbell, of trying to predict and trying to understand. Marketers have long understood how to steer swarms without the mechanism, without the mechanistics. They've been struggling over the past 100 years, but it sounds like they're getting it right.
And I think that's right. And part of what's lost, maybe not lost, but sometimes forgotten, is that we human beings are amphibious. We are spiritual and we are material. We are right there at the nexus between heaven and earth. Where is that Peugeot book? Oh, here it is. You can read about such things in this little book. We're right there. That's us. The nexus of heaven and earth. And so I often use the example of school spirit. We generate school spirit, but we participate in school spirit. We may have great spiritual power, or we might have a little bit of spiritual power. The principal probably has a little bit more spiritual power than a student, but a student can have dramatically more spiritual power than a principal, given certain relationships in terms of the spirit.
Because we started with canceling gamers, and now we're canceling entire countries. So I'm going to argue that they've figured out the math. They're just hoarding it at this point. They're not actually sharing it. The same way any good data hoarding venture capital firm would do. They're not going to give up their black box. Nobody ever really does. So it's now on us to kind of deconstruct those who have this type of advantage. And we're definitely circling the concepts.
And again, when you say those and you mean individual people, probably not. It's exactly the one level up. The spirits that have the people.
Coming around with the language. And the humans as the substrate part, I really want to focus on that a little bit more here. In my particular brand of weirdness, the autocult concept, human emotion is the underlying protocol of human communication. So the human has a feeling. The feeling then hijacks the body then manipulates the space around it, which then sends energy over to another person. It could be
right. It's not reason.
Sonic, could be light, could be whatever. Inside that energy is the encoded feeling of the behavior. The recipients then read it, they deconstruct the energy, they then reconstruct the symbol to the best of their ability. That was encoded in that energy, and then
and again, when he says it's the feeling was encoded, no, the feeling is just how you're experiencing the spirit.
poof, the feeling has translated or it has gone viral or mimetic in current terms. That's the underlying action of an autocult, and that generates symbols because the communication generates basic symbols that preserve, or at least the symbols allow you to not have to constantly communicate. So if I say, hey, there's a thing over in that dark forest, don't walk over there. Okay, there's a symbol for the dark forest. You're not going to walk with it. I don't have to constantly remind you or warn you the symbol is now held. So it's kind of like an energy efficient savings of the brain. The symbols there are doing that. And then morality is a collection of symbols that were useful. So like, hey, here's this, this is evil.
Now, again, morality isn't of itself a collection of symbols, but the way that we participate in morality is through symbols. And it can be not just symbols, squiggly lines or words or images. It can also be actions, because actions, symbolic actions. I mean, so if Russian soldiers cross the Polish border, that's symbolic of the war between the nested principalities, because what the whole business about NATO is that Poland wishes to be nested beneath NATO or beneath the European Union.
Evil, this is good. It's kind of like a way of, again, it's saving neural energy for the entire group is what morality does. So instead of having to constantly warn the entire group, we have moral frameworks we create and say, hey, don't, take a rest on Sunday, or, wear this scarf or wear this symbol or whatever, it'll protect you. Whether it's accurate or not, who knows? But the morality side of it, that formation is traditionally slow and organic. People develop this over generations, in fact. But going to Mr. Campbell's point regarding the fast update, the really quick turnaround tick update of that creates a brand new emergent economy. Now, when you're dealing with rapid changes, almost like a high frequency trading algorithm kind of approach, the emergence that happens is best described via economics, and that's going to be law of large numbers. So when you're dealing with rapid changes, rapid transactions, whoever controls the vast majority of transactions tends to control the price of access to the network. And the same is true for morality. If something is out there constantly changing.
This little part right here, I'm going to have to listen to a half dozen times to really get it into my head. I won't make you listen to a half dozen times, but this is key here, and this little section will really begin to steer the entire conversation.
The more networks, whoever controls the vast majority of transactions tends to control the price of access to the network. And the same is true for morality. If something is out there constantly changing the moral frame, your transaction cost plummets, you control the entire substrate, and then bang, that's it. So you can actually frame predicting where these AIs using the human substrate through morality hacking, using basic economic terms once you shift it in that frame. Once you see that it's all about purchase power and price control, that's it. You can actually,
and this is just purchase power and price control, the commodification of moralities. And once he said that, it's like, yeah, this is happening. And especially because in some ways, Facebook and Twitter and YouTube are the Bitcoin of moralities. They're hosting the currency. Now, of course, or maybe they're the blockchain of moralities, because these things aren't the moralities themselves, but the moralities are hitching a ride, and the spirits of these moralities are hitching rides on all of this, and they're cycling. They've been tremendously sped up through them. Now, again, the printing press was a speeding up of this, and the telegram and the newspaper, Neil Postman, and then radio and television and cable television, and now the internet. It's just accelerating.
We start identifying and using economic toolkits to start hacking that stuff. The fear of and shifting back a little more, yeah, basically autocult is, to summarize those simple principles, if Mr. Rob's talking about the swarm. I think I summarized it before the start. Swarms describe the behavior and the coordination. Egregores describe the symbolic interface, and autocults describe the mechanics. And you can probably fracture autocult into two different disciplines, whether it's command-based or market-based. But the idea is that those moral shaping agents, which are cybernetic in nature, those are part human, part algorithmic, they do have to answer to economic realities at some point. And so
Okay, so a lot of the things we're talking about, these spirits, they're all upper register. But when they get into real, which is where the two registers meet, they have to answer. They have to interface. For them to instantiate, they have to deal with the lower register. And that's the makeup of this world.
the limitations of those economic realities can help you predict where the next swarm is going to pop up. And so
and we do this intuitively. When you see something and you have a pretty good grasp of the economy of a subculture. For example, when the Neeland Avenue Christian Reformed Church declared to its classis and to the denomination that it was going to ordain the woman, the lesbian woman who was married to another woman, immediately in the Christian Reformed Church, we knew what was going to happen in classis Minn Coda. Now, again, most of you listening to this have no idea what I'm talking about, but you'll have your own analogs in your own subcultures. We have them politically. Something happens and, they're going to pay attention to that. I may or may not be interested, but they are, and we know it because we understand how this stuff works.
That's it. Real simple, right, guys? 101 stuff. Come on. Mr. Hall, I pass the torch to you.
Okay, so how do we do this? How do we sort of find the path? How do we find the pocket on this thing?
Now, I haven't done a lot of commentary on Jordan Hall, partly because he can sometimes be very meta, and so it's hard to that's very upper register. It's hard to sort of, okay, well, what exactly are we talking about? Need more illustrations.
So many different possibilities. So we're dealing with something which on the one hand clearly has been present since shortly after Homo sapiens became sapiens, which has novel characteristics in the context of the moment we find ourselves in, things like digital network technology, et cetera, et cetera. This particular kind of thing in the contemporary context has as one of its quite likely trajectories that we are all dead, or at least mostly dead, or would prefer to be dead.
Now this death, again, this tends to be bottom-up perspective because, well, dead, but don't forget the upper register, because at least biblically, if you look at, see, this is one of the main differences between atheist physicalism and, let's say, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, that the upper register comes first and the upper register creates the lower register. Okay. It goes this way more than this way. Now, the way it works continually is heaven and earth. And even, again, Jesus' Lord's Prayer. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. The end of the book of Revelation. A new heavens and a new earth comes down from heaven. So this is, the biblical direction is this way predominantly, at least in terms of source. And that's opposite the bottom up, which is in physicalism, it's bottom up. And that way the upper register is dependent upon the lower register. The lower register is primary, the upper register is derivative and dependent. Whereas For something like Christianity, the upper register is foundational, and even our language, the upper register is primary, and the lower register is the creation of the upper register. It's almost an idealism, but I don't think it is.
And not theoretically, like as John points out, it's getting super practical very rapidly. So the stuff that Schmachtenberger and I have been hand waving and freaking out about now for a decade is no longer like, could be like this. It's now, no, just exactly like that. See that right there? Just like one more step, maybe two. Okay, so that's one thing. That's a whole sort of piece. And I think it's sort of nice. It's sort of appropriate. Let me see. I want to like drop something like a big thing in the middle of the pool, and then ignore the fact that I just did it and step away for a little bit and let that settle and then go to another place. So if we're in this mode of consideration, like trying to really contemplate this thing that we're talking about, or at least that we believe that we are talking about, one of the first things that we have to notice is that literally everything that we're using to engage in the process of talking about it is part of the arms race of these things that have been going on since we've been sapiens.
I think it's a really smart point.
Very important. So any concept that you believe you can use is already a tool in the war between these things. Concepts like time and causation are not, in fact, fundamental in a way that can allow you to operate outside of the context of being in, let's call it, egregore space.
Now, him saying that is already an undermining of the physicalist position, or at least the reductive physicalist position, because the physicalism, generally speaking, says time and causation are determinative of everything, including upper register aspects and elements.
And so this notion, for example, of there's something going on whereby egregores are participating in a field of conflict, and there's questions about how we might choose to show up in that context. Time itself is up for grabs. Causation is up for grabs. Right? So there's really interesting implications of what happens when you really dive to the bottom of this particular well. So we'll let that one.
And that's certainly true if you're working theologically.
Just be chewed on for a while, but it's part of the proposition. So then the next one is actually quite interesting, which is something like, it does seem like, just from my own first person point of view, a couple of things. One is, it seems like I would like to actually have free will in this context. Like, it seems like I would like to believe that I have the
let's say some agency instead of free will,
capacity to make effective choices in accordance with values that seem to be my preferences. It's interesting. Like, it doesn't feel to me like that is a non-thing. Secondarily, it also appears to me, in my own consideration, that there is in fact a path for doing it that is somehow more fundamental even than the objects that we are talking about, that they are not deeper in base reality than concepts like free will or notions like free will, which is interesting itself. By the way, if either of those two are false, then there's no point in us having a conversation. So it's important to just keep that in mind.
And that's another great point.
So then we can actually begin to engage in some pruning rules from the deeper substrate and work our way up to think about what might be strong enough considerations that have the capacity to truly respond to the context we actually find ourselves in. So maybe that feels like a good place to put it. Like, can we actually just sort of step into this, accept the premise? And I think it's proper to accept the premise. Certainly in the context of the framing that we've got, it's worth considering deeply. And say, okay, well, what would it imply if we actually accept the premise in terms of how do we find ways to navigate our way through this on the basis of concepts and constructs that are strong enough to be invariant across the various shifts that are plausible? So our first proposition I put forward is something like, it's unlikely that the primary content of the notions that we're talking about pre-exists Homo sapiens. And it's reasonably likely, although, by the way, I should say.
And see, I tend to think that's not true. I just don't think it's true. I think we are dealing with a battle. Again, I'm just this is nakedly a Christian idea that we are dealing with a battle that is prior to us and larger than us. Sort of like, imagine that there are ant colonies beneath the home that I live in, the home that was built in 1960. They might imagine that the disruption in their world put there by my home in 1960 is the start of things. Oh no, it's a lot of what those ants are dealing with goes way before 1960.
Hey, there's deeper substrates that are clearly conserved all the way down, like the notions, the things that emerge at the level of sociality and things that emerge at the level of behavior in general clearly are precursors to what we're talking about. Nonetheless, there's something novel about humans and Homo sapiens that creates a particular context. We can think about that. And the second is that it does appear to be something along the lines of an arrow of time, that there is in fact something like a past, and that the past has particulars that are variant in the sense that they are what they are and they're not going to have changed. And there's something like a present, there's something like a future that we can make some meaningful statements about. Seem to be nice premises to start with. All right, I will pause now. Just toss it into the room.
Okay. Well, that was great. Yeah. I see so many like connection points here. First, I'll do BJ's Igor's. I use something similar, but different. But it connects up nicely. I'm looking at the basic rewiring or reprogramming of our minds, how we've changed the way we think.
Jordan Hall must have spilled his water. He's emptying out his keyboard, poor guy.
Based off of McLuhan's notion that the medium changes us. And one of the things I focus on is the shift from deep independent thinking to pattern matching in order to handle the information flows that we're getting. I saw that really early on in social networking is the information flow was too great. And all you're doing is just picking out things that catch your eye, that are new or fit some patterns that you're actually curating. But when we start to move towards what we're talking about with
and again, much of that is not rational or intentional or even conscious. And that's a deep underlying thing in this will be that after the Enlightenment, we really love to imagine, and Vervaeke makes this point often, that somehow conscious rationality is that which is controlling the world. And if there's anything that we should have discovered with cognitive science, and I still have to listen to one of the more recent McGilchrist things, is that that's not true. And that really frightens us because we want conscious rationality of Homo sapiens to be the governors of this world. And in terms of Christianity, we're not. We're stewards, but we're not owners.
Igor's is that we're doing a co-curation of patterns. Okay, these patterns are this kind of cohesive, can't say substrate, but a cohesive way of looking at the information environment that makes it easy for individuals to understand. And one of the abuses of that is the way a lot of the more popular ones are built. And this goes back to a lot of the stuff I'm doing on tribalization is that people tend not to be able to agree on what they're for. They're very much more able to agree on what they're against. And so almost all of the more popular groupings are, the anti-fascist, the anti-racist, the anti-misogynist, the anti-colonialist, and the anti-vaxxers, the you can keep on going on and on and on. But the anti is sufficient to create a network of people who are co-curating a pattern that describes the behavior and the language and the actions of that enemy. Whereas they may not actually agree on anything that they're actually for, the reality they want to create, which is kind of a strange way to kind of an inverse morality for in order to give you a morality. This is also interesting.
I think that's a super strong point.
Like it's also pretty interesting in that we're trying to solve the same. We're all trying to solve the same problem at the macro level. China's trying to solve it as it's probably the only competing system out there, and we are. And how do you maintain stability and dynamism in a world that's complex, that's throwing off challenges constantly, that's roiling the pot, where complicated solutions don't necessarily work or they fail badly on a routine basis. So China's taking this morality portion, this network portion, and then locking it and saying, okay, we're going to base it off of Confucianism. We're going to build a system to lock it in place, and they're going towards extreme stability. And
now basing it off Confucianism, it's very wise in that it's already there. You're not going to. I mean, in the West, we have this stuff. We're gonna start new. Again, this is this cult of conscious rationality. We can see everything in the world and we can figure this out. And I think that's just dumb. The world is too complex, and so Nassim Taleb, go back to older systems and build on those, because those are already battle tested for ranges of things that you can't consider because we haven't thought of them for a long time. What presents are problems. Go back to the Vervaeke Awakening from the Meaning Crisis about problems. Problems develop and we address those problems and we tinker with it, but it's sort of, again, like you're going to start with Android or iOS, and probably Android because it's open source, and you're going to build from there because you're not bringing, so you've got Windows and Mac and Linux and almost anything that comes out of this, and you say, well, the world of computing or the world of mobile operating systems is wide open. Why not Tizen? No, it's not. It's every now and then you're going to get a big revolution and something new, but you start from something that's already battle tested. China's not dumb.
Here we are in a system that's on this extreme dynamic end, that's running amok. And we have a couple different layers here. At one point, I add a little Freud thing here, is that kind of the left side tends to be more on the superego side, and the right tends to be more on the id. That's bugging me. That's, I hate that. This is too much. That pinches, right? And the middle ground.
And it's so interesting that I think he's right. So the left now is super ego. The left used to be id, hippies, and the right was super ego. The polarity is switched.
The ego is this system. It's run primarily by corporations now, and the corporations are skewing it in ways that are deleterious to its development, because they're kind of a mesopredator in this new environment, and they don't have any of the socialization necessary to actually serve as an ego function. And that's where we're running into problems. So it gets back down to Patrick. One second.
I heard gets down to Patrick. I think you might be up.
That usually just causes people to leave. So.
Yeah, I have a 90-year-old in the house, so she likes the old style phones. Sorry about that. Okay, so to a certain extent, we're actually all fighting about who's going to set the standards for building that ego function, that thing that controls and bounds us, creates enough stability that we don't fly apart, and allows enough dynamism to do this. And how to do that, I think, is going to be these AIs that live in the space in between us, because that's where all the data is. That's where all the investment is in those AIs. And, really love the concept of being able to see our individual contributions within that framework. Patrick's work on trying to figure out the programming languages for the implementation of the solution for that is pretty cool. I've been working on trying to ways to just bound it on a macro scale with rights, with ownership, at least older concepts, and infusing it into the system in order to provide a level of stability that doesn't allow this thing to run amok, because we don't have any controls on corporations, and they're not limited by constitutional structures and the like, so they can, run amok whenever. One other thing that was interesting was one of the triggers, or one of the things that I see in being of use in this pattern matching world is that one of the things that lets these swarms grow so quickly are empathy triggers. So the memes or the pictures coming out of Ukraine, or seeing somebody victimized and then shared, the pictures of that victimization are shared online. Because we're in a pattern matching mode, we don't have any of the barriers to the automatic empathy that empathy isn't sympathy. It's actually a involuntary modeling of another person's mindset.
If you haven't yet, watched this video, because that deals with it directly, because Rousseau basically has empathy at the bottom of his moral system. And that piece of Rousseau, in fact, has lodged pretty dynamically in our culture to have, you hear it used all the time, empathy as a shortcut for morality. It is one of the deepest ones we've got.
A pre-verbal dump of information that where you're filling in the blanks, and that mindset is yours, and you've developed a kinship with that person, so that we're seeing these empathy triggers create this kind of fictive kinship and this tribalization, using this enemy as the focus for action. There's a lot of cool combos. We're all coming at it from slightly different ways, and this is a good discussion.
I feel like my approach, or my view of the thing, might be the most dismal of all of you guys.
I'm talking about nuclear war, so I don't know.
Accepted.
Yeah. But yeah, I get that you're talking about nuclear war. Like, one thing I brought up in Rebel Wisdom when I was on there a couple of months ago, it's like, it doesn't matter. Like, okay, I told him, I said, after COVID, it's going to be something else. And after that, it's going to be something else. And then the next thing was this nuclear war thing. But after that, provided we get through it, it's going to be yet another thing. Right. Analyzing this on
apocalyptic.
Yeah. It just
call
keeps
it the
getting
permacrisis.
worse.
You might,
right. Exactly.
Permacrisis is a good word for it, I think.
It's a really good word for it.
Good. I'll try and start using that. But I feel like there's a certain amount of it's like a law of conservation of freak out that has to be met, right? And the thing that concerns me is so China's got their way of managing the narrative, the egregore. They're just going full authoritarian on the amount of information that anybody can see, right? And so everybody builds their worldview based on whatever China says the worldview should be built on. What we have in the West right now is everyone builds their worldview off of whatever is the most viral, right? So, like, maybe Ukraine's winning, maybe they're not, but I'll tell you what.
Now, everybody builds their worldview off of that which is most viral. This is exactly what Peugeot was talking about in terms of attention. This is the attention god, and this is worship in our culture. And it doesn't matter if you're a Christian, or I know lots of Christians, trust me. I know lots of Christians that they're Protestants. Well, I don't have an altar in my home. Oh, no, you do. You have the altar to set.
A few months before I was born, my dad met a stranger who was new to our small Tennessee town. From the beginning, Dad was fascinated with this enchanting newcomer and soon invited him to live with our family. The stranger was quickly accepted and was around to welcome me into the world a few months later. As I grew up, I never questioned his place in our family. Mom taught me to love the Word of God. Dad taught me to obey it. But the stranger was our storyteller. He could weave the most fascinating tales. Adventures, mysteries, and comedies were daily conversations. He could hold our whole family spellbound for hours each evening. He was like a friend to the whole family. He took Dad, Bill, and me to our first Major League Baseball game. He was always encouraging us to see the movies, and he even made arrangements to introduce us to several movie stars. The stranger was an incessant talker. Dad didn't seem to mind, but sometimes Mom would quietly get up, while the rest of us were enthralled with one of his stories of faraway places, and go to her room, read her Bible, and pray. I wonder now if she ever prayed that the stranger would leave. You see, my dad ruled our household with certain moral convictions, but the stranger never felt an obligation to honor them. Profanity, for example, was not allowed in our house, not from us, from our friends, or adults. Our longtime visitor, however, used occasional four-letter words that burned my ears and made Dad squirm. To my knowledge, the stranger was never confronted. My dad was a teetotaler who didn't permit alcohol in his home, not even for cooking. But the stranger felt he needed exposure and enlightened us to other ways of life. He offered us beer and other alcoholic beverages often. He made cigarettes look tasty, cigars manly, and pipes distinguished. He talked freely, too much, too freely, about sex. His comments were sometimes blatant, sometimes suggestive, and generally embarrassing. I know now that my early concepts of the man-woman relationship were influenced by the stranger. As I look back, I believe it was the grace of God that the stranger did not influence us more. Time after time he opposed the values of my parents, yet he was seldom rebuked and never asked to leave. More than 30 years have passed since the stranger moved in with the young family on Morningside Drive. But if I were to walk into my parents' den today, you would still see him over in a corner, waiting for someone to listen to him, talk, and watch him draw his pictures. His name? We always called him Set.
What I can't do is I can't judge whether or not they're winning or not based on my Twitter feed, because my Twitter feed's full of Ukraine stuff blowing Russia stuff up. Now, it's fun to watch, and I'm an addict to that stuff. I love watching those videos, but I know that I'm not going to be able to figure out the scoreboard from that, right? So the fact that, so like when people start outsourcing their sense making to their phones, they're moving themselves into a virtual space away from reality, and then what their sense making is about what's happening in the phone, not what's happening in the real world. But see, so like postmodernism doesn't work in the real world. You can't like plant seeds of postmodernism, but it works in there. It works in the phone. And so that's something that's, as we shift into this thing, whoever can create, you're creating reality in there, and everybody believes the reality you create. And this is one of the main kind of like struggles right now between like, your rule proles and your technocrats, is that some of them are attached to reality and some of them, are gone completely virtual almost. But what is true in the virtual world is what is viral. So it does. So the more that dominates, the less actual truth, real truth, is understood.
Notice how much we're bumping up into real and truth. And again, the how this, whether you think it comes from above or comes from below, is really critical. And again, I mean, Vervaeke is right in that it's transjective. It's coming up, and it's the two are pushing against each other.
And so we steadily step further and further away from ground level truths and further into, crazy rabbit holes. Right. So this is it's a sense making apocalypse ramp that doesn't go down.
Never will.
So if it never goes down, I mean, there's got to be a breaking point. This goes back to sort of Jordan Hall 2018 conversations, right? Like, where's the breaking point? We're obviously a lot steeper up in the ramp than we thought we were going to be at this point 4 years ago, I think. It was always kind of conceptual back then. And now that it's happening, most of the people who are talking about it back then don't even realize that it's happening. It's only a few people, like some of the Stoa people, and certainly nobody in a major, none of the major thinkers are thinking about this stuff. They're all stuck on Twitter yelling at each other because their editor told them to, right? And
let's call them influencers, just to make a nice distinction.
well, I mean, influencers also sweeps up Zendaya and stuff into it. I mean, like I'm talking about like major, like heads of corporations and everything else, and like people who are supposed to be intellectual and supposed to be like leading the conversation, they're stuck in doing the same behavior that everybody else is, right?
And churches are, yeah.
So like when John was talking at the beginning, the reason why all the corporations went and boycotted, Nestle won't make Twix for Russia. That's not going to affect the Ukraine war. They're doing it anyway because they've been captured, right? They didn't save a single Ukrainian by refusing to make Twix, but they're doing it anyway.
It's all about raising awareness, guys. Come on.
All right, hold on. So, Pat, can I take this for a second and then throw it back here? It's like a couple of big chunks that feel like they're useful to capitulate. One, I think what I'm hearing is something like the crisis will escalate until morality improves. Okay. A second one that came to me is that phrase, I think it's phylogeny recapitulates ontogeny. And it's interesting.
Unpack that. I think there's a lot of viewers aren't going to get that because I didn't.
Yeah, so the phrase specifically refers to the hypothesis that when you take a look at the actual development of a human, for example, or any other animal from an egg to its adult form, it actually goes through a series of developmental stages that are recapitulations of the evolutionary development of its underlying species. So we actually do go through a fish phase and a lizard phase and a mammal phase until we enter into, by about the age of 22, the age of the Homo sapiens phase. The metaphor I would like to apply horizontally. I would take the metaphor, copy it, pop it up transcendentally, and pop it back down in the context of egregore space. Right? So perhaps there is something like we are currently in the limbic phase of this particular developmental arc of this particular sort of egregore modality. Right? So there's egregore modalities that evolve on the landscape of Homo sapiens in the context both of nature and a given technological substrate. And they go through a series of evolutionary dynamics and they achieve some kind of state. And by hypothesis, we're dealing with essentially a limbic stage, or whatever point you'd like to put it at. It feels like limbic's a pretty good tag of this developmental arc, which could point us towards what the next stages might look like and how we might want to actually transition into them.
Now, again, this is where it matters whether you think these things start with us. Again, that's from the bottom, that's physicalism coming up, or that we are the product. This world is the product of things that are far older than we are.
The last chunk I would put out there is, by hypothesis, if this is not the first sort of event that this has occurred on, we might be able to take a look at kind of conservation rules in egregore space and say, okay, well, one of the rules that I would put forward is if you are going out to encounter egregores, you should bring some egregores with you. And so, for example, in the long arc of human culture, the emergence of monotheism in the context of the interplay of egregores, which those times are called gods, might actually give us a story, a path. Like if we simply jump to the end state and say, okay, the way this thing ends up is what is the sort of highest possible point? And can we actually articulate the architectures that work?
Should really read City of God all over again and look at late antiquity where basically, I mean, if you listen to Tom Holland on this, basically Roman emperors were trying out gods in order to master all of the little gods that were all over the place. Augustine in City of God spends time mocking the polytheism and basically, again, back to Tom Holland's thesis that I'll reword it, the carrying costs of all the little gods was too great. And so you needed one god that could basically trump them all. And if you read the Gospels, you pretty much see that with Jesus and his exorcisms, because Jesus is exorcising these spirits. But then Jesus makes the point, Okay, once you drive the spirit out, you'd better fill the house. Otherwise, 7 more spirits worse than the first will come and occupy it.
From that highest possible point down, this is going to be the attractor state of any evolutionary trajectory where we may be able to skip over some of the more catastrophic steps by hypothesis.
That sounds to me like in order to fight egregores, you need to build one. And it seems to me
Egregore
like
design,
Patrick
my friend.
and it
How we hand
seems
it
like
off.
And again, you can. So I live in Sacramento, and we're building new subdivisions, not as fast as we need to, but you build a new subdivision, your Mello-Roos will pay for the new schools that go in the area. And so you go from Central Valley farmland or foothills grazing land into high school, and at some point a school spirit will develop. Now, that school spirit doesn't come from nowhere. It gets the John Dewey, some of his spirit is in there. Erasmus got some very old code in there. The culture of the city. I mean, on and on and on and on. These spirits don't come from nowhere. Again, part of my critique of this is we're not really designing spirits. The spirits are there. It's sort of like the dog. I can go to the Chris Pacal videos. It's sort of like the dog trying to design a new master. The dog can't design a new master. Now, the dog can in some ways try to train the master and interact with the master, and dogs, in fact, will do that. And anyone who's had a relationship with a variety of dogs know that the master trains the dog, and to a degree, the dog trains the master. But this again, part of my critique of this conversation and many other conversations done by people who are now using the secular definition of the term non-religious is that it's still locked in the Enlightenment assertion that we are in charge of this world. And I know, I'll just play a little bit. Another great video came out today.
In any time you talk about any kind of foreign affairs, there is a school of thought, usually on the left, which sees the West as being always totally responsible for whatever happens. And I was thinking about it, and I was like, actually, that is a comforting feeling, because it avoids dealing with the fact that there are external actors with who want to do you harm, and there's nothing you can do about it. Actually, what it does is it makes you think, well, if only we stop doing...
Now, the first part of this is part of the reason for the evangelization of Northern Europe, that Jesus exorcises the spirits of the various religions that were there before. And the next emotional motivation, at least this is part of it, of course, because I'm not totally negative. I'm Protestant, so I'm not totally negative on the Enlightenment. I think the Enlightenment had to happen, and certain things needed to be addressed. But there are other layers of it here where you have this emotional reality.
Doing this, or we stop doing this, the world would be a safe place. You harm, and there's nothing you can do about it. Actually, what it does is it makes you think, well, if only we stop doing this, or we stop doing this, the world would be a safe place. And it kind of made more sense from that perspective of like, it makes the world feel more controllable. It makes it feel like, well, if only we stop provoking someone like Vladimir Putin, everything would be okay, rather than Putin's got his own agenda, Putin's got his own motivations.
Yeah, and I think the biggest flaw in, broadly speaking, like people think I'm sort of right-leaning or whatever, and I'm on some issues I am, on some issues I'm left-leaning. But the reason I bring this up is I'm about to make a broad generalization about the left. And there's broad generalizations we can make about the right too that are not flattering. But about the left, I would say the biggest flaw of the left is an unwillingness to recognize reality and a preference for your own ideological view. And on the right, there's the reverse, which is an over-preference for reality, which is often which is often not reality, but the kind of status quo, and an unwillingness to recognize that actually reality isn't quite as rigid. And yes, with a bit of effort and social effort, you can change things. But the biggest problem on the left is an unwillingness to accept in this particular type of conversation that there is always going to be a civilizational struggle between East and West, North and South, and whatever, and that not everything is a product of our behavior, and some conflict between civilizations is inevitable, and maybe we should win that conflict, because if we don't, well, all the things you care about, like equality and diversity and anti-racism, might be in question if Russia or China are in charge of our society. So,
yeah, it seems like Patrick had some ideas about economics at the beginning that I'd really like him to talk about, because
we'll go with the ping pong metaphor here, not the volleyball metaphor, because it's not quite a set, but we're just going to pop it over to you.
Yeah. So, from an economic perspective, what you just described, Mr. Hall, is price discovery. That equilibrium point in which you have supply and demand curves converging. And there is
and again, markets are another very interesting thing, because we are not in control of markets, and we participate in markets, we try to influence markets, and so in some ways markets are an older form of egregore that we've been fairly comfortable with.
A supply of morality, and there is a demand for morality, and that's we're starting to put metrics on that, and that's a hard way to think about morality, because we tend to attach meaning to reality, meaning and purpose and belief.
Now the intersection of meaning and morality is an interesting thing to follow in this conversation.
But belief is a commodity. We've commoditized everything. We'll commoditize you. It's all just prices cutting their own throats all the way down at this point. The internet has proven that. Since we're on the topic of, we've all come together on the birth of the newest recursion of nuclear Cold War isms, it's fun to point out that, just to bring my point home, that it was the fear of nuclear war that was like one of the most attractive parts of the early internet. It was the idea that I could watch the TV and be told, like, oh no, 30 more Palestinians were killed in this really complicated geopolitical scenario that I can't control a damn thing about, but I can then hop on the internet and actually go talk to Palestinians, or go talk to Japanese people, or go talk to just actual people that I'm seeing on the news for the first time. I was like 13, and it just blew my mind. I'm like, I don't need...
Not now. We can participate in this at a level we never could before.
The news, I'm actually talking to these people. I don't care. And I learned very quickly that a lot of people just happen to be the same. It was interesting, not like kumbaya quality stuff, but we had some underlying substrates.
Guess who was raised evangelical over there?
That were going on, some basic premises of communication that were going on, regardless of culture, language, gender, scientific anything. It's just humans being humans on a really limited medium. But of course, identity politics comes back. It took over the substrate, and now look at that. Cold War mechanics are now fully automated. They can be popped and deployed, and you're updating your morality. So the purpose of that little dalliance is to show that morality, that symbol curation, that transferring it from meaning and person to commodity, that egregore in which morality has to have meaning is very much at odds with morality being a commodity.
And this gets into again, Jordan Peterson land, in terms of meaning being a gyroscope of base reality, of truth, let's say. And so then suddenly when moralities are priced, there's price discovery of moralities, and you see, again, as a pastor, you see that all the time. People are constantly pricing their sexual morality, let's say in their 20s, and doing the price discovery in their 50s about what they did in their 20s. And I think this divorce between morality and meaning is, again, another element of the meaning crisis, Vervaeke's meaning crisis.
So, like Mr. Campbell, you had mentioned that the people who should be serious about this stuff, well, that's technically an egregore as well. That they should be serious. The professionals are on Twitter yelling at each other, right? They should not be doing that. There was once a world where they weren't doing that. They were acting as these elements of guidance or these civil components who were providing something useful for the mass benefit of everyone else. Now they've devolved into screaming monkeys on Twitter. But that's the reality, is that they're screaming monkeys. The reality is that they've always been screaming monkeys. It's just that there was this blip in time in which they had moral responsibility as well. And it shouldn't be a surprise that the Jerry Springer generation has just eliminated all manner of moral responsibility. But that may create a demand for morality. And so these egregores are going to come in and they're going to do a price discovery collectively. They're going to find who is willing to. It's going to be this like race to the bottom. It's going to be memes forever. It's morality as a source of meaning is over. It's done. The postmodernists have won. And now it's just morality as a commodity, and trying to describe that.
And I don't. We can't live with the divorce between morality and meaning. It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. A meaning crisis is going to be had, and you're going to see the inversion. And that's exactly what we're seeing already in many of these spaces. You flip from postmodernity into often a very traditional religion.
That without wanting to off yourself is really hard for the current standing generation and the older ones as well. But we're seeing it with the internet, and it's not going away anytime soon. In fact, it's consolidating. It's finding cheaper ways to do it. And the internet that we went through in the West, that hasn't even been rolled out to the rest of the population of mankind yet. So all the stuff that we went through between 80s and now, that gets to happen to India. That gets to happen to China. That gets to happen to Russia. That gets to happen to Africa. This is going to take 200 years to resolve. We're going to be in this cycle of price discovery morality for the next 200 years.
Well, let's not forget that each of these different subpopulations have a very distinct relationship with the category of egregore. For example, in India, they got no problem with the notion of egregore, right? The arbitrary creation of symbolic structures manifesting different characteristics of higher order reality is...
They're not arbitrary, but he's right. Keep going.
It's their fucking soup. Right? So it's going to be interesting to see how Indian consciousness integrates with this particular reality, which is so disruptive to the analytic constraint of the Western mind. Right? Western mind is a very particular challenge. The Eastern mind, by the way, my read of it is the celestial dragon and the mandate of heaven is a very available fucking egregore that precisely responds to chaos by essence. And the chaos of digital is being responded to by the most powerful egregore that the Eastern mind can possibly perceive, which is what's actually manifesting. So Emperor Xi is simply playing the role that is already available with an egregore that is properly designed to deal with this exact situation.
Right. It's not just real quick. It's not that those societies are either sensitive or resistant to egregores. It's that very few societies know how to deal when egregores are doing price discovery collectively.
Very few societies know how to deal with egregores when they're doing price discovery. Yeah, price discovery of morality that's part of what's been speeded up. And part of what's going on in churches, because of course churches curate morality far more consciously than many other communities.
Yeah, I like the whole tribalism tie-in. I mean, the whole Dunbar tribalism, when you're in a tribe, you have kind of this group consciousness and knowing what the tribe should do and next, and this trust. You won't try to cheat somebody on a or deprive somebody in the tribe because that will affect the tribe's viability. I mean, if it's a small amount of tribe, if it's a big tribe, it's about to split, then there will be that kind of duplicitous behavior. But that long-term horizon and that trust that develops, and that ties into gifting cultures and the like. But as we went beyond the tribe, in order to develop trust frameworks necessary for anything to get done, we developed this legal system and the way the markets work now and the way bureaucracies work with ethics and all this other stuff in order to create this kind of workaround for scaling beyond that tribal knowing. And they have a lot of flaws. I mean, these systems are not effective in many ways, but they're effective enough to allow us to scale population and do things on a macro scale, to do business with somebody that you don't know, and trust enough that I would actually, the transaction would go through. And so now we're adding this network decision-making system. And, we had a bureaucratic hierarchical decision-making system that we turned into practice and tamed. We had a market-based decision-making system that we turned into practice and tamed, put limits on it, structured it. Now we have this network decision-making system that kind of resurrects a lot of that, earlier tribal group decision-making and process. It's nice. It's interesting to see it manifest itself, but it's also scary because the way it's emerging so quickly, just like after the digital, after the printing press revolution, how millions of pamphlets descended on Europe and challenged everything, and everything tended to fly apart. And these new organizations like bureaucracy, until you understood that the bureaucracy could as easily mobilize resources to kill millions of people as it is to mobilize resources to save a million people, and learning how to tame it and have it work in the right direction, it doesn't have any inherent morality, is an interesting process. It's kind of the challenge we're faced with this, is how do we make this develop in the right way? I mean, right now, a lot of the morality is being developed on the fly, based on what you're against. And you could see it that one specific thing in play is that when they only demonize the people that are against the change, or what they consider somebody who's against a specific new right or capability, but not the excesses of the application of that right. Right. So if something goes wrong and it's like, oh, hey, I'm not going to think about it. I'm not going to argue about it. That's not really something I'm going to focus on. But if you oppose the right at all, or oppose that one instance, you are the enemy.
Right. You don't. And this is part of when they talk about this stuff. You're in religious organizations like churches, because these things have been practiced in churches for a very long time. If you declare skepticism or heresy within the church, boom, the antibodies are right there. If the church sanctioned methodology is not adequately addressing the need that it's supposed to address, crickets. And now what happens is, over time, at some point, people will just sort of slowly leave. And again, I have this saying about churches. Churches split right and leak left. And so what we have with these now new moralities, not terribly well-formed religions, is that they can just keep leaking left. They'll have some fractures, but they'll just keep leaking left.
You're part of this. We saw that most recently, I think, with the swimming trophies.
Right.
It's not that it's no one's adjudicating the positive aspects or the viability of those positive aspects. Everyone's just adjudicating whether or not you oppose it or oppose anything that's being done.
When you're talking about again, your lens is heavily weighted on systems. So we have bureaucracies and we have banking systems, and we have this and that. The credit system was invented by the banks because it was useful to them. It had a function, right? And then we use that because it has value. The systems that are being invented by the modern
Now that's a lot of exaptation there. If you sort of meta that word,
egregores are completely tied up, not in whether they work, but just in whether or not they're viral, they're popular. So, like an example of this might be healthy at any size. That doesn't work. That's dumb. But it's become,
and this is where if your egregore is moving too high up, healthy at any size, it's gonna crash down at some point. It moves too high up and it crashes down.
Promulgated because it's popular, and because it becomes viral, then it becomes true, right? So what's going on right now is, like, if we want to go back to sort of
and you can have that with a degree of, children, the massive numbers of children who are experimenting with gender identities. It's going to fly up and it's going to crash. And when it crashes, it's going to be a lot of wreckage.
The OODA loop conversation at the beginning. Not just religions have, OODA loops, but any kind of culture as it evolves. The rate of cultural evolution, as long as it is on the generational scale, it gives you enough time to decide whether or not that change was whether that change was of any value, right? Does that make sense? And then you can decide whether or not you want to make a change to that change, or whether you want to roll it back, or whether you want to do whatever you want to do, right? These things are happening so quickly that we don't have time to figure out whether they're changed. So that's not evolution, that's cancer, right? And
that's cancer for the society, because it's non-functional, and the cell replication is happening so fast. When it crashes down, it destroys the whole system.
So there has to be something that slows the rate of change down with what's going on. And if we don't have that kind of, if there's no function to slow that rate of change down, and I can't figure out one, but I'd like to throw it out to the peanut gallery. Maybe somebody figure it out. The only logical thing to do, if we can't figure out a way to control the rate of change of the societal frameworks, is to, build a bunker and buy a bunch of bullets. Like that's
exactly the problem,
option, right?
That's the long night, right? I've been thinking about this long night as the ultimate bad thing. It's like when that,
and of course, a bunker and bullets isn't really going to help you, because a bunker and bullets are all about the lower register. Bullets, stockpile food. All right. Well, if you're in a federal penitentiary where they're giving you food and shelter in a steel cage, the bunker with bullets is only prison underground. It's not, you can't live, human beings are upper and lower register. You can't live without the upper register, and so many things in the upper register have to do with other people and community and all of this collective stuff.
Crazy what view of reality takes over the corporate structure, the ego function, and it dominates and tells the corporations that this is way you have to think, and that gets into the infrastructure. That becomes the thing that is dictated. We become China by default through the back door. So where the conversations in the public sphere are narrowed down, these are topics you can't talk about, and that gets narrower and narrower and narrower as people object to different portions of it. And then you're there. Once it's in the infrastructure, then you're locked in. It's a long night. It's stasis forever.
It's worse than China, because China is trying to build an authoritarian mode of thinking that is based on Confucianism, and the modern sort of Western thing is just building a way of thinking that's based purely on virility, which is just feeding people what they want to hear. It's like having a diet that's entirely sugar. So
I just want to pause, let that sink in. the West is built on Christianity, but the markets have just sort of taken off, and that's a powerful picture that he gave.
We can have like a higher, like the even higher level concept to simplify is it's worse than China because China is happening in China with Chinese people in Chinese culture, and in very particular this kind of thing that is, let's say, the Chinese kind of mind that develops in that context, most notably, by the way, in the context of the Chinese kind of language, which is very distinct from the Western kind of language. Right? So if you think about it in terms of development, the way that your mind assembles itself, there are stages of development, and those stages have irreducible implications for the kind of mind. They're just sort of path dependent on the way that your mind comes into being in the world. So, orality predates literacy by definition, obligate. So you'll have an oral kind of mind, at least for some period of time, before you have the particular structural dynamics and the sort of enabling and disabling constraints of a particular form of literacy imposed on top of it. But then you're going to fork. Right? An alphabetic mind precisely is the kind of mind because it has ontological primitives that are decontextualized atoms, with the premise that decontextualized atoms are meaningful in and of themselves and can be synthetically aggregated into components of meaning. Is like a fundamental piece of Western mental grammar. Obviously, virality becomes a thing that we're catastrophically attracted to because simple,
this, I think, is a brilliant and fascinating point, and I think in some ways it gets back down to, I mean, even the Chinese characters themselves are in some ways sacraments, obviously in the way that alphabet is not. Now remember, Aleph Bet starts Hebrew, Aleph Bet, alphabet, Aleph Bet starts in Hebrew, and this again is where you've got your upper and lower register, and that but then things are going to have to somehow keep it down on the ground so it doesn't get up too high and then crash. And so that's, in a sense, sort of what the Mass did in the West throughout the medieval period, that the sacrament is what holds heaven and earth together. And because, again, we are holding heaven and earth together because we are the stuff of earth and the breath of God. God breathes into the man that he makes out of the dust of the earth.
The sort of the typewriter scheme is perfectly valid in our kind of mind. Eastern mind is composed of objects that are in fact meaningful only as wholes. Right? A particular brushstroke doesn't have any meaning separated from the actual ideogram. So there's a completely different landscape for the evolution of these particular dynamics on. And that's helpful, by the way, because it tells us a lot about how these things will actually evolve. Is something about the nature of the landscape upon which they're evolving. Right? If I could say, hey, there's a pool of water over there, I know that there's going to be more life in the radius around that water than over here in the desert. And the desert life's going to have different characteristics. Let me throw another one in that I think is very powerful. And I agree, by the way, BJ, completely with your fundamental premise of speed. And I think it specifically interfaces with the notion of meaning and price discovery. Or morality. So I would say is something like morality is fundamentally grounded in meaningfulness, but has a niche for exaptation. It grounds in a meaningfulness. When I say it grounds in a meaningfulness, all I mean is that all behavior ultimately grounds in fitness. At the end of the day, there is a checksum in the degree to which you literally survive into the next moment at all, full stop. I mean, in the most fundamental abstract sense. And so any coordinated choice-making infrastructure that is ultimately going to be grounded in that. However, there's a gap between the symbolic structure and its ultimate checksum in reality. That gap is a niche for parasitism, and that parasitism is precisely what we're talking about. Any possible solution has to be something that is able to maintain continuity between the interface layer of egregore space, which, as you say, is operating at right now at a very high rate, all the way down to grounding in reality. Right? So there's like a series of gears that are able to actually govern the relationship between the rate of change. So the problem we actually have is we actually have an ungroundedness. We will ultimately ground back in reality. It may be our extinction. Right? The Homo sapiens may just not survive this fucking thing.
And again, when I listen to this, part is emanation and part is emergence. And the physicalists tend to emphasize the emergence and not understand that it's both ways.
or something that is a radical decomposition of technological infrastructure, we end up being sort of back to indigenous, which is maybe a good result. But our objective is to find some way of actually holding that groundedness with continuity of contact all the way up to the surface area that these egregores, these digital network computational egregores in particular, are interfacing with, so that groundedness is binding it completely. Yeah. And that, by the way, is how I would recapitulate the notion of meaningfulness and morality together. Right? A true morality in the context that we're operating in is meaningful, which is to say that it's actually able to hold continuity of contact between reality and the actual surface area of our sensorium as it's relating with the adaptive landscape that we're dealing with, the social field.
And that's right. And that's why it's meaningful. It's meaningful because it actually affords that which morality is always seeking. So I think this is enough for today, and that will give you a start. The last half hour is excellent too. The whole video is really outstanding. So we'll see if I come back and do any commentary on the last half hour or not. But it's well worth your time to listen to the original and to think about what's going on in this space. So leave a comment. Let me know what you think.